The following program contains adult content. Some scenes may include graphic truthfulness, shocking honesty, and revealing insight. Viewer discretion is advised.
Hi, and welcome again to Adult Content here on WHDT. My name is Brian Content. Welcome to the show tonight for this Monday. We're in October. It is October 2nd as the year moves steadily onward. Coming up on the show today, since the war on terror began, since this country has been fighting it, a lot of stories that have eventually proven to be false have come to the forefront that have been thought to be true. Let's say weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, or whether Osama bin Laden had kidney problems. Well, on the show today, my guest is an author and investigative journalist who has picked out 22 myths that he says have undermined this country's ability to fight the war on terror. We're going to go over those and find out what, in fact, is the real story behind some of these popular myths. But first, let's check the top news of the hour. Former Congressman Mark Foley said to be undergoing treatment in an alcohol abuse facility. His attorney, David Roth of Palm Beach, said today that Foley checked himself over the weekend, admitting that he had problems with alcohol and his emotions. Foley resigned on Friday and is now under FBI investigation for salacious email exchanges with teenaged congressional pages. Iraq's prime minister has taken a positive step toward uniting warring Sunni and Shiite factions within his government. These factions are thwarting his efforts to halt rampant sectarian violence in that country. The prime minister today unveiled a plan to get the parties to talk and also extended the extended state of emergency in Iraq for another month. Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice said she cannot recall then CIA Chief George Tenet ever warning her of an impending al-Qaeda attack in the United States, as the new book by Bob Woodward alleges that he'd done 2 months before the attacks of September 11th. To this, Rice said, quote, "What I am quite certain of is that I would remember if I was told, as this account apparently says, that there was about to be an attack in the United States, and the idea that I would somehow have ignored that I find incomprehensible," unquote. Well, a new Supreme Court term opened today, issuing a ruling that could result in the deportation of a now elderly former Nazi concentration camp guard. John Hansel sued to overturn the U.S. government's decision to revoke his U.S. citizenship. Justices declined to review the case. Hansel was a member of the SS Death's Head Battalion that guarded concentration camps near Berlin in 1943 and in France in 1944. The nation's third deadly school shooting in less than a week took place today in Pennsylvania, where a 32-year-old milk truck driver took about a dozen girls hostage in a one-room Amish schoolhouse. Police say he then barricaded the doors with boards and killed at least 3 of the girls before killing himself. Well, partly cloudy skies are in the forecast tonight with some isolated showers. It'll stay breezy with lows in the mid-70s inland to around 80 near the coast. And then for tomorrow, expect isolated showers in the morning, building up to about a 30% chance in the afternoon. Highs in the mid to upper 80s with east winds at 15 to 20 miles per hour. All right, coming up next, the author of a new book on how myths are undermining our efforts to fight the war on terror. Adult content continues in a moment. And welcome back to Adult Content. Before we get started and we meet our guest, Richard Miniter, I just wanted to say a couple of words about the situation that came about late last week with Mark Foley, the congressman who represents the northern Palm Beaches across to the west coast of Florida. I've known Mark for many years, working as a reporter professionally, had the opportunity to interview him on many occasions and watch his career as he went from a business owner in the city of Lake Worth, all the way up through being a city commissioner, then to the Florida House of Representatives, all the way on to Congress, and that now with this information. And it was, I think people always gave Mark Foley the benefit of the doubt when it came to his sexual preferences, and this would usually be a big story. But he was a Republican, and for some reason he seemed to be a really good politician and a guy who seemed to have things on the ball, and he was really straight with his people. And so I think from a news standpoint, nobody wanted to make an issue of his sexual preferences, but now he seemed to have, with what has come to light, really kind of taken everybody's, best interests and really turned them on their head. And all that trust that went out to him, he's really blown it. And it's hard to find any way to kind of forgive him for what's happened here. Of course, all the evidence is not in, but I did read one of those emails that he wrote to one of those congressional pages, and he put himself in the position to where he was championing the cause of protecting young children, and then to put himself to where he is actually taking advantage of the children he is proposing to champion, I think is just about as low as you can get. I just want to know one thing. Is he going to get a pension? And if anybody has the answer to that, I'd like to find out about that. Please email me at adultcontent@bellsouth.net. Okay, we're going to have more on this coming up this Thursday, talk a little bit about what Mark Foley's state of mind might have been and what might have led him to go down this road. But first, let's talk to Richard Miniter, who is our terrorism expert. He is a New York Times Bestselling author. He's an award-winning journalist. He's written 2 books prior to the one we're going to discuss today, Losing Bin Laden, How Bill Clinton's Failures Unleashed Global Terror, and Shadow War, the untold story of how America is winning the war on terror. Richard, how are you doing, sir?
Very well. Glad to be with you.
Thank you. You've written a book called Disinformation, 22 Media Myths That Undermine the War on Terror. And I got to agree with you, there's been a lot of bad information surrounding Americans' efforts to fight the war on terror. But the name of the book, 22 Media Myths That Undermine the War on Terror, why did you choose to word it this way?
Well, of course, publishers pick titles, not writers. But
I see.
I think the sense of the title here is that these myths are not just false information, but information with a point. In other words, using false information to discredit the war effort or to make it harder for us to win the war or to make it seem hopeless.
Now, for that to happen, then there has to be a vested interest in wanting to see things remain lies or untruths. And you've, I guess, got onto that and felt that there was a need to really set the record straight on a lot of this because you felt that it does undermine the war-fighting effort. Why did you pick out the myths that you did and decide on what was going to be included in the book?
Well, I decided to focus on myths which were widely believed by large tranches of the American public. I wasn't going to go after obscure things or things that only existed on conspiratorial websites on the right or on the left. I wanted to go to things that the average person has said, I've always wondered about that. I haven't had time to check into it myself, but I always wondered if that was true. Mm-hmm. And then that's sort of why I chose these myths. That's why I decided to focus on things like the myth that there were no Jews who died on 9/11. Of course, many Jews died that day, as did 3,000 American citizens total. But it's important to let people know, wait a minute now, this is a myth, and it's a poisonous myth. It's one that's designed to divide the country. Or the myth that we haven't found any weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. We have found some small amounts of materials for making weapons of mass destruction. We found roughly 4 American tons, for example, of radioactive material that could be used with further processed for making atomic bombs.
I think there was really no question that Iraq had chemical weapons. I mean, they used them quite documented in the war with Iran. But wasn't the issue there that they were now stockpiling a new stockpile of chemical and perhaps biological weaponry that they were building up and continuing to work this program, not having stuff left over that we knew that they in fact had?
Well, the inspectors left Iraq in 1998, and by 2003, almost 5 years had passed, and we knew very little about what the Iraqis were up to, and all of it sounded ominous. Now, if the Iraqis wanted to avoid war, they could have simply let the inspectors back in and got a clean bill of health, if in fact it was a clean bill of health. Mm-hmm. Another myth is the idea that we've looked extensively for weapons and simply haven't found them. That's not true. When I was in Baghdad in November 2003, I spent an hour or so with David Kay, who was in charge of the hunt for weapons of mass destruction, and he told me that his team rarely, if ever, left the green zone in central Baghdad. They did not go up and down the country looking at suspect sites. They spent most of their time translating documents. There are about 9.5 miles worth of documents that were captured out of Iraqi archives that just deal with WMD. 9.5 miles just relating to weapons of mass destruction. That's a lot of material to go through.
So just spending time in the green zone looking at documents would be enough to really take up the time of teams of investigators then?
Absolutely. And there were a lot of suspect sites that they went to very early on. They might have found things. But, of course, by now those sites have been looted. But if they made a priority early on in the invasion of examining those sites, you might have found more. One biological weapons facility that the UN was especially worried about, they did send a U.S. Army team in there to investigate, and they discovered that the entire site had been washed clean with some sort of disinfectant designed to kill the germs they were manufacturing there. So they found no trace of anything at all. It had all been bleached. Every flat surface, every rounded surface was coated with noxious bleach. That tells you the Iraqis, as they retreated, were trying to hide something. We just don't know what.
You would concentrate in one of the chapters on how myths get started, and you provided 6 different ways. Let's talk about the ways that myths actually get circulated. Everything from honest errors to leaks and people with agendas.
There are people with agendas, and sometimes foreign intelligence services want to trick the American or the Western press because they've got their own foreign policy objectives. For example, the idea that bin Laden had kidney problems was put out essentially by Pakistani intelligence. They were getting a lot of pressure to help the United States arrest bin Laden or terminate his network. This is before 9/11. And they decided to put out the myth that he was dying of kidney cancer or had some sort of unrelated kidney ailment, which means that he would go away as a problem and that there was no need to pressure Pakistan. And this was their agenda. So sometimes it's foreign intelligence services that have their own agendas. Sometimes it's ideological groups on the right or on the left who want to trick reporters. Sometimes reporters are just lazy. And sometimes they're honest errors. For example, one story I think that appeared in some of the Boston papers was that a rescue team had gone down to the World Trade Center the day before the attacks and was waiting around to rescue people after the attacks. Well, obviously that would be big news if it were true. But what happened was they interviewed the rescuers on the spot who talked about coming down, quote, the night before, and they didn't look at the whole soundbite. They were talking about being in the area the night before, not coming down for this specific purpose. And of course, when you interview somebody a day or two after 9/11, everything kind of blurs together. It's one of those moments that is one of the most dramatic moments in anyone's life.
Yeah, it sure is, and I suppose this could have been expected. I mean, and I did a show recently on the on myths or supposed conspiracy theories associated with 9/11 and the attacks on the Trade Center and on the Pentagon, and just that in and of itself has enough myths and stories that have taken on a life of their own to keep you busy for weeks. How does this? I mean, I'm still trying to understand, how these myths just take on a life of their own. I mean, once they get ingrained, is there something about the human mind that will only pick up certain bits of information and have it stick, or is it the soundbite mentality of our journalists now with the the way media is presented these days that just kind of leaves people with these short impressions of what are actually the facts?
Well, no, it's the fact that the media is so interconnected now, and everybody's quoting everybody else or relying on facts from everybody else. So if one error gets into the system and it gets repeated enough, it kind of lives on. And even if one publication realizes the mistake and corrects it, another publication will not realize the mistake and not correct it. And then when somebody from the first publication is doing a story 6 months later, and he does a Nexus search, he goes, oh, I didn't know about this, and he'll quote from the second publication, not realizing that it's a mistake. This kind of thing happens over and over again.
Yeah, very interesting. And, of course, your background is investigative journalism, so you knew that there were ways to prove these things, true or not, and that was just by good old hard news journalism, getting out there and tracking down the sources.
The tracking down sources, spending a lot of hours in the library as well, going places, interviewing people, comparing accounts. Yeah, it's a lot of work. And if I wasn't writing a book, it'd be almost impossible to do this on a daily deadline.
Do you think that's an inherent evil with what's going on with the way news is reported these days? That everything is just brought in so quickly, and as you mentioned, no time, people just parroting things and not. Is there something inherently wrong with our fourth estate?
Yes, though it's not what you think I'm going to say. I think the problem is journalism schools, journalism degrees. If I owned a newspaper or a television or radio station, I would never hire anyone who had any classes in journalism.
Let me stop you there, Richard. I'm sorry, we're coming up on a break, and I want you to continue that thought and finish it, but we do have to take a short break, and we will be right back with more with Richard Miniter and his book, Disinformation, right after this message. And we're back on Adult Content here on WHDT with my guest Richard Miniter, who is a New York Times Bestselling author, a terrorism expert, and also a good old hard-nosed journalist, which is what I like, having been there and done that before. And Richard, you were making a point about, this nation is lacking something, back to the basics kind of journalism that you were talking about before we went to the break. Would you go ahead?
I think journalism schools and I think journalism undergraduate degrees are a big part of the problem. I don't think those people should ever be hired. We should shun them and drive them out of the business. Why? Because it's important that people know facts. Take a science class, take a history class, know something. Because it's great when you're reporting news to be able to put things in intellectual context, to check things against your embedded base of knowledge. And I have all sorts of interns who come to work for me from time to time who've got